Having answered the questions, why do serial killers exist, and why are so many of them from the US, we now have all the context we need to answer a third question. Why were so many serial killers active during the 70s through the 90s? 20 years that are referred to as the golden age of serial murder by the true crime writer specialized in serial killers, Harold Schechter. It's thought that at least 80% of all known serial killers were active during this period, but there's no need to resort to statistics. Both you and I know that whenever one of these criminals is mentioned by name in pop culture, it's almost always a case from that moment in time. Those 20 years gave birth to all the myths and stereotypes that are now staples in the entertainment industry, as well as within our own culture. Killer clowns, the charming man next door who hides in plain sight, killers who eat their victims and sleep with their corpses, killers obsessed with certain body parts or patterns, the ones that write letters to the police, among many, many others. In fact, the term serial killer didn't even exist until 1974. The unprecedented number of cases were so overwhelming that the FBI had to create it out of necessity. They needed a way to distinguish them from regular murderers. Naturally, since most serial killers are from America, I will focus mainly on what happened in the US. Let's get right to it. How did such an enormous increase in serial homicides come about? Cities were developing and growing even before the beginning of World War II, but it was the exponential economic growth and technological advancements that came afterwards that made them into the most populated places in the country. At the beginning of the 1960s, the whole white picket fences lifestyle began to crumble. The small Christian communities, where everyone knew their neighbors, composed of traditional husband and wife families producing kids by the dozen, started to disappear. Slowly, but surely. It was a great time to be ambitious, to get away from home and start a business, to meet new people and new places. Besides, the expansion of the developing major cities made jobs less available in small rural towns. You know the drill, mines being closed, highways being built, lands used for the construction of buildings, urbanization at its best. So naturally, during the 1960s, a great number of youths moved from the suburbs to big cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, which were doing especially well at the time. I don't have to tell you that all the major companies resided in big cities, so there were plenty of jobs available. Furthermore, a big city was the best place to start your own business because more people means more potential customers. If you wanted to even compete in any given market, you had to be in a major city. That created a vicious cycle. People moved to the cities for jobs. The increase in population meant that more businesses started to appear. These businesses created more job opportunities, and the cycle starts anew. When money calls, people answer. That's the logical thing to do. However, where most folks saw opportunities to make money, there were some that saw opportunities to commit murder. This increase in population completely shattered that old-fashioned society in which everyone knew their neighbors and were familiar with each other. It became a society of strangers, one in which you could see someone's face once and then never see it again. This anonymity that was once impossible became a fundamental tool for serial killers. Whenever someone is murdered, the most likely suspects are the ones who were close to the victim. So, if the culprit is a random stranger, the case becomes much harder to solve. This is still true today, but especially at that time, it gave killers a tremendous advantage over the police. Consider the fact that even though cases of serial murder existed before the 70s, they were extremely rare and understudied. The average detective was completely clueless when it came to cases regarding victims of serial killers. But that's not all. Even if people left the small towns and picket fences behind, they didn't lose that mindset of familiarity. They were used to trusting the people around them. They hadn't adapted to the city lifestyle. Besides, serial killers weren't even a concept yet. They didn't expect to be kidnapped and murdered by someone they didn't know. So they frequently hitched rides from strangers, or got into someone's car to go get a drink, or got lured into a house for a party. You get the idea. idea. Also, there were a lot of people who couldn't make a living in these major cities who turned to prostitution. Desperate and usually alone, they were the best prey for serial killers. The Second World War, the one in Korea and the one in Vietnam, all happened close to or during this period, which means that there were several generations of youths exposed to the glorification of war and violence. America wanted soldiers and made damn sure every last one of its citizens knew that they were needed on the battlefield. The war propaganda machine was firing on all cylinders, but the glitter and patriotism only lasted for a short while. It didn't take long for the young men who enlisted with red, white and blue in their eyes to realize the horrors of war. Fantasies of heroic deeds became stories of brutality. They felt in body and mind the true meaning of violence. Mass graves and piles of bodies, the smell of burning flesh and gunpowder, the blood and limbs of their fellow soldiers. Life suddenly became very cheap, and death became all too familiar. Not only did some of these broken men become serial killers themselves, but their children did. The number of children who were raised in a hostile environment, victims of psychological and physical abuse, skyrocketed. Traumatized parents and dysfunctional families were aplenty. Veterans with PTSD turned to alcohol, drugs and prostitution, exposing their families to that addictive behavior and the hostility that came with it. Some kids never saw their dads again, which forced their mothers to raise them alone, in a time where their options were very limited. Some mothers turned to prostitution. Some of them neglected their children, and some of them married some very bad men out of desperation. These generations of kids came of age in the 70s, 80s and 90s respectively. Needless to say that the moment in which most serial murderers start killing is when they reach adulthood. I want to clarify, it's not that every kid whose father was a veteran had a horrible childhood. There were lots of veterans that were fantastic parents and gave their children a wonderful home, but that wasn't the case for a lot of them. The main issue here, as I said in my previous video, is having a traumatic childhood, not necessarily being raised by a veteran. The main takeaway from this factor is that having more men coming back from experiencing the situations of extreme violence present in war made the number of dysfunctional families and traumatized children rise exponentially. Now, I want to make something very clear. It's not that the police were a bunch of idiots. They simply had never seen anything like this before. They weren't trained to catch serial killers. And suddenly, a lot of cases started coming out of nowhere. Every time something unexpected or new appears, there's always some time required to adjust to it. That time gap gave serial killers another advantage. When every detective agency was in disarray, debating on how to deal with these cases, they had total freedom to exploit the outdated parts of the standard investigation procedures and the legal system, without mentioning that security cameras and DNA-based forensics techniques were in the very early stages of their development. Having said that, methods like profiling and other cutting-edge ideas created by the FBI were deemed as useless at the beginning. Cops would rather do things the old-fashioned way instead. They felt threatened by younger people with innovative ideas, so they prioritized their pride. No profiling or looking for patterns, simply interrogating anyone near the crime scene and coming up with theories based on things they already knew. Theories that were tainted by the racism, sexism and homophobia that were rampant at the time, especially in law enforcement environments. Now, this video is not about politics. We're talking about 50 years ago. Racism, sexism and homophobia existed, and that ain't social commentary, it's history. That meant that white men were given the benefit of the doubt more often than not, that victims that were prostitutes were ignored, that cases of sexual abuse were dismissed as lower quarrels. You get the picture. So not only the police were severely lacking in experience when it came to cases of serial homicide, but they were also close-minded when it came to employing new methods for solving them. That's bad, but far from the worst. The worst display of police incompetence, and the one that most contributed to the proficiency of serial killers at the time, were just how disconnected the authorities from each state were from one another. Getting relevant files and reports from one state to another was a slow process that gave killers even more time to evade capture. By the time you got the information you needed, the criminal was already in another place. The detectives were always one step behind simply due to the inefficiency of the process. Basically, every murder that happened in, let's say, Texas was only registered and stored in Texas. So you could kill 10 people, move to another state and easily change your identity. Since the records of your crimes were only kept in Texas, as long as you didn't get caught, nobody would know of those 10 murders in a different state. Nobody would know there was a serial killer at large. It was as if those crimes never existed in the first place. Besides, that left detectives of each state with missing pieces of the puzzle. Scenarios like this were fairly frequent. One person had killed 5 people, 1 in state A, 3 in state B, and 1 in state C. In state A and C, nobody would think of a serial killer since it was just one murder. And in state B, they would know it was the work of a serial killer, but they would assume that they had only killed 3 people. Trying to find a pattern between murders without having the full picture is almost completely useless. It's that pattern paired with interviewing witnesses that enables you to create a psychological profile of the culprit and narrow down the number of suspects. Let's say the 3 victims you know about were all women with brown hair. You would assume then that the killer chooses his victims based on that. But if the other 2 murders that you don't know about were women with blonde hair, then the theory of the killer choosing women with brown hair falls apart, and every decision you make based on that is automatically pointless. You'd be stuck chasing shadows. Ted Bundy famously took advantage of this to murder 30 women in 7 different states for years. But he wasn't the only one. Gary Ridgway managed to murder 50 women for more than an entire decade, simply by moving the corpses of his victims to different states. The most aggravating case of them all might be Rodney Alcala, a man suspected of being one of the most prolific serial killers in the world due to the hundreds of pictures of missing persons found in his camera. Yet, by moving from state to state and changing his name, he was only convicted of 5 murders. Do you remember how I said that serial killers are prone to heavy drinking and substance abuse, and how that contributes to their cognitive decay and psychosis? Well, let me show you a graph that represents the overall alcohol consumption in the US throughout the decades. If you look closely, you can see a dramatic spike in the 70s that slowly goes down until the end of the 90s. That's right. This period is, by far, the moment in which more liters of alcohol were consumed per capita in the entire history of the United States. Curious, isn't it? Many people disregard substance abuse as a factor in the development of serial killers. I wonder if they still think that way. Oh yes, it feels like we've already been here before, doesn't it? During this moment in time, the media was even more relentless than it is today. Honestly, in the FBI official website, they literally mentioned them as an obstacle, and they are absolutely right. While the FBI was working around the clock to figure out the situation and figure out methods to stop the murders, the media did everything they could to get in their way, reporting every murder, giving private information to the public, sometimes outright lying or making speculations to make the killers more shocking, while at the same time openly questioning the competence of the police. I have already said enough about them in my previous video, so I'll keep it short. Interviews, magazine covers, articles on the news, they were basically shoving serial killers at people's faces. However, if I had to pick the moment that kickstarted this whole circus into motion, that'd be Bundy's trial, the first trial in the US's history broadcasted nationally. Every fuck-up wannabe murderer saw the entire thing from the beginning, and they got the message loud and clear. This man is a star. Charming, fascinating, attracting big crowds and cracking jokes with reporters. Imagine a psychotic person starved for attention, fantasizing daily about committing murders. Watching TV at that moment, I bet they thought, hey, I can do it too. I want to be in that screen. Now, try thinking of a bigger motivation than that. In those times, lead was steadily used as one of the main components in things like gasoline and paint. Exposition to lead, especially at a young age, might contribute to the development of violent tendencies, and just when it stopped being used in the 90s, there was a drop in criminality. This is the reason a lot of people consider it an important factor in this golden age of serial murder. Now, nobody knows for sure, and this isn't completely impossible, but in my opinion, and I clarify, this is just an opinion, this is complete nonsense. Lead was used in a lot of countries besides America, and it was also present in many things even before the 70s. There are millions of environmental factors that could have contributed to that drop in crime. I think it's nothing more than a coincidence. I don't consider the usage of lead to be relevant at all. But it ain't just me. The first meta-analysis investigating this theory came out in 2022 and was named the Lead Crime Hypothesis, a meta-analysis. And it concluded that, while a correlation between declining lead pollution and declining criminality is supported by research, it is likely not a significant factor in reduced crime rates. First, let's get the obvious out of the way, shall we? People eventually got used to life in the city. They learned not to trust strangers and became more cautious all around, sex workers included. There aren't as many kids running around unsupervised or hitchhikers. Besides, you would never get into a stranger's car nowadays. Forensic science has come a long way, and now we have many more tools available to identify individuals, DNA analysis being the star of the show. Furthermore, we now have security cameras everywhere, and progressively, the ways to become anonymous have become almost non-existent. GPS tracking devices, IP addresses, you get the picture. The justice system became more familiar with serial killers and, in return, adapted itself to deal with them in a much better way. Sentences became harsher and parole hearings stricter. But the turning point, what served as a catalyst for all these improvements, is the creation of VICAP, or the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. A spectacular idea by the FBI, who are not only the best agency in the world at catching serial killers, but also responsible for developing most of the tools that are used for dealing with them worldwide. Make no mistake, the FBI, they are the heroes of this story. But back to VICAP. It's a shared database between every police department in the entire country, loaded with cases in which a serial killer may be involved. This led to an easier identification of patterns and got rid of that slow and stupid method of transferring information between police departments from one state to another. Moreover, the media calmed down a little bit. They stopped trying to pin every missing person as the work of a serial killer and refrained from further giving them more attention. Now, I would love to say that they grew a semblance of common sense and realized that They were adding more fuel to the fire, but you know the media. I have no proof, but in my opinion, they were probably told to stop by the FBI. God bless them. So, are they gone? Well, mostly. You don't hear about every serial killer that comes up now, which in turn contributes to fewer people becoming serial killers, along with everything I have just mentioned. There are still serial killers out there, but their numbers are a fraction of what they used to be in the golden age of serial murder, and with every year that passes, their numbers continue to decrease. They can't get to that second victim that easily now. Always remember that this is an analysis based on the knowledge that is currently available to me, and that these are my own conclusions, my opinion. You're welcome to leave your thoughts in the comments, even if you disagree with me. I guarantee you that as long as you're polite, you will always be treated with respect. You're also welcome to leave suggestions for future videos if you'd like to do so. Thank you for listening to me until the end. This channel has grown beyond my wildest dreams in the past weeks. You have no idea how happy you've made me, and how grateful I am to you all. But I don't wanna get all sappy. I have rambled for long enough. As always, my friend, much love, and I hope you're alright. If I was 18